Hi, y'all. I'm Izzy Cates, and I'm a volunteer lead with Abundant Housing Atlanta. Abundant Housing Atlanta is a volunteer-led organization that advocates for and organizes around more sustainable and affordable housing. We come from all backgrounds and careers. What unites us is a common interest in building an inclusive Atlanta, one in which new residents can thrive and legacy residents have the ability to age in place with dignity. If you're interested in hearing more about AHA or getting involved, please see me after the talk up front. So tonight we're going to hear from Marjy Stagmeier. Marjy Stagmeier is an affordable housing landlord and a founding partner of TriStar, a nationally recognized real estate investment firm in Atlanta. Marjy led TriStar to develop its sustainable housing model that targets large, blighted, and marginalized apartment communities near failing elementary schools, and creates health and education interventions through a broad spectrum of community partnerships that address the social determinants of health. Marjy has owned and managed apartment communities representing over 3,000 units. A graduate of Georgia State University, she passed the Georgia CPA exam, is the chair of Star C, Edu Housing Communities Corporation, advisory board co-chair of House ATL, board member of the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, former board chair of the Atlanta Community Food Bank, and former vice president of the Atlanta Commercial Board of Realtors. Marjy recently released her new book, Blighted, a powerful narrative about the decades-long decay and remarkable two-year reinvention of Summerdale, a 244-unit aging apartment community located in one of Atlanta's grittiest corridors. Marjy is going to be telling us all about the Summerdale story tonight. After her presentation, there will be some time for questions. So without further ado, Marjy.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really an honor to be here in this historic library. So as I was introduced, I want to thank YIMBY for also having me come present. It's close to my heart. I think that this topic of housing is basically the core of YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, and I think it's important that we mix up our affordable housing throughout our city. Let's go ahead and get started. So as you see, this is Summerdale Apartments. Isn't she pretty? Only a mother could love. So I was a Monopoly champ of my 6th grade class at Hambrick Elementary in DeKalb County Public Schools. And I told my parents that night when I was a champ that I was going to be a landlord when I grew up. And I have all girls, all sisters, and my parents were at the table and they were like, okay, yes, that's lovely for a 11-year-old. You know, we'll support you. But my father, when I turned 14, said, go get your CPA, which I did, and it enabled me to really launch a career in real estate. So here's some examples of some deals that I've purchased. I really like the blighted older properties. When I started my career, I worked for a company called Matushka, a German-based company, and we were the largest investor with Post Properties. And I just found those properties so boring. I mean, it was so predictable. It was all about profit. It was all about money. You didn't really do anything for society. So I just kind of gravitated. When I started my company, my first company, I started gravitating to these property types and found that I could really combine my love of community with my love of being a landlord. So that one up there is actually Madison Hills Apartments. It was a 446-unit property up in Cobb County. So here's some examples of some properties I've owned around Atlanta. As Izzy mentioned, I've owned and managed about 3,000 units. Actually got another 1,500 in the pipeline. So probably within the year I'll own about 4,000 or be a partner in 4,000 units. But you know, just the traditional vintage 1972 apartment communities around Atlanta. So this is Summerdale. I was invited to speak to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you would have thought the Pope was coming. We kept having all these meetings to talk to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And on one of the calls, I think we ended up having 4 calls. There were 3 landlords invited to meet with them to talk about income mobility, how to get people out of poverty into middle class. And on one of the calls, someone said, congratulations, Matthew, on winning the Pulitzer Prize. And I was looking at the list going, Matthew? Who's that Matthew Desmond? And I looked him up. He had just published Evicted. How many of you have heard of the book Evicted? It's very popular. And he had just won the Pulitzer Prize. So the big day came, and they came into our room and said, we lied, it's Bill and Melinda Gates. So I got to spend an hour with them, which was really cool. I mean, they're just the loveliest people. But I got to spend an hour with Matthew, too. So afterwards, he was standing there. I said, let's go have lunch. And we did, and I told him my story. He encouraged me to write. He goes, you need to write this book. And I, after reading Evicted, kind of patterned it after Evicted, where I had just purchased Summerdale. And I had selected 15 people I was going to follow, and which is the thesis of the book. It's the people who live and work and sell their drugs at Summerdale Apartments. So what's interesting is this whole journey for me has been a real learning experience. It has completely changed my DNA on how I manage housing, because I had never sat in the living room of a tenant. I had never sat in a police car. I had never sat there and watched drug dealers and tried to understand their ecosystem, or really gone and see the impact of roach infestations on healthcare. So what I've evolved to is community capital. I've realized that when you are in a lot of these large apartment communities, they're mini cities. I mean, the one I showed you, Madison Hills, is 446 units. A lot of those units were 3 and 4 bedrooms, 990 bedrooms. I mean, 4,000 people lived at this apartment community. That's a mini city. And being the landlord, you're kind of like the mayor of the mini city. You can really control what happens in that environment. So I've become a big fan of social capital, which is the networks of relationship among people who live and work in a particular society, enabling that society to function effectively. And what I learned, when you go into these blighted apartment communities, typically the drug dealers control the ecosystem. You know, the people that live there are not free to roam around, to get with their neighbors, to build social capital, to network, to try to find jobs. So I've become a real big fan of social capital and using housing to help people build social capital. So let's talk a little bit about the neighborhood, Cleveland Avenue. I'm assuming everyone in this audience knows Cleveland Avenue. Yes? It's about 3 miles that way, south of Atlanta. Here are the demographics. So as you can see, between 2000 and 2015, the population actually declined in Cleveland Avenue. Now, this is boom city Atlanta. It declined. That just doesn't happen. And it's right within the city center. Our median household income was $26,000. That's poverty. The poverty level is roughly $25,000. And the majority of the tenants were renter occupied. So you can see this neighborhood within a 1 mile radius had very high poverty. Right adjacent to our apartment, literally about a block away, is Cleveland Avenue Elementary. Cleveland Avenue Elementary has a 43% mobility rate. Who knows what mobility is? It's the number of times a child moves schools. And every time a family has to move to chase affordability, they take their child out of school, and research shows that they lose 3 months of education. So I've probably underwritten 100 of these blighted apartments. 100% of the time the school's failing. I mean, that's how close the symbiotic relationship is between housing and education. So here's Cleveland Avenue Elementary. They had a 43% mobility rate. That means every year they lost 43% of their students. Children coming into the school, only 27% were reading at 3rd grade level, by the 3rd grade. Luckily, Dr. Payne, who's in the book, I followed her throughout the book, is a rock star principal, and she got her reading numbers up to about 76% before the children graduated at 5th grade. But this school also had the most active shooter lockdowns in the city of Atlanta. And the first time I met Dr. Payne, there were 8 of us in a meeting, and it was kind of messy. She had donuts out and things for us, but it was just kind of disorganized. And she said, I apologize, but we just had a shooter lockdown yesterday. I was like, what was that? She goes, well, it's when, there's an active shooter on the campus or across the street from us. And she just kept going on with her agenda. I was like, excuse me, how often does this happen? She said, well, once a week, twice a month. It happens quite often. I was just shocked. And so literally we went back to our property and we asked our security guy who had 3 kids in her school. He goes, oh yeah, it's this guy Nut. He pulls out pictures of him. It's this guy here. He lives at the apartment community behind her. He operates at the Exxon across from her. And he shoots his gun at the McDonald's in a turf war all day long. And so we told our police officer he was arrested within a week. And a year later, I was interviewing her again, and I asked her how the active shooter lockdowns were. And she goes, we haven't had one since I met you. And I didn't tell her what we had done. So it just goes to show you how, and that really terrorized these poor kids walking to school every day. Here's our crime statistics. So the year before we bought the property, we bought it in 2018, there were 440 911 calls, of which 275, you can kind of see over here, were for violent crime. armed robbery, shots fired, fighting, stabbing. And the drug dealers controlled phase one of the property. They weren't calling 9/11. We know the violence was probably twice this. But the point is this was a pretty violent crime. And I put the history in the book because the property was foreclosed in 2009, and you could see it was relatively safe. I mean, not so many, but it went from 66 to 490 9/11 calls within a course of 8 years, from foreclosure to an absentee owner. This was a dangerous dwelling. So it was out-of-state absentee owner. What's interesting, too, is we track purchasing power. So you can see when we bought the property, 244 units, the total household income was $3.6 million. That's why all the commercial was boarded up. There was no discretionary income. And this is the cost of municipal services. Someone mentioned earlier we should do something with property taxes to basically motivate landlords maybe to take care of the property. We paid a whopping $18,000 in property taxes, and we consumed $1,006,000 in municipal services. This is why municipalities don't like these apartment communities, is they consume municipal services. If I'm going too fast, let me know. I'm a fast talker, so I'll keep going. So here's a summary of the neighborhood. We had high poverty. We had a low-performing school, very entrenched criminal activity, limited community amenities. Luckily, we had market rents around $650, so they fit the metrics. We had a lot of legal and illegal tenants, limited commercial business activity, and our municipal services costs far exceeded the property taxes. This is a dangerous dwelling. The AJC's been writing about them. There's about 280 of them in the city of Atlanta. Next steps. So this is how we knew, whenever I buy these properties, this is how I know I'm successful. Basically, affordable rents. Our goal at this property was $730 average. All right? Neighborhood and physical environment that promotes health, safe playgrounds, et cetera, and crime is stabilized. So we wanted people to be out in the community. We wanted to build community capital. Strong community partnerships to address education and healthcare. Tenants are empowered with social capital. And Cleveland Avenue is successful. That's, to me, the main thing. We want to see our school improve. Y'all think we can do it? Takes a lot of work. So here was our turnaround plan. First off, we had to go raise $12 million. It started at 9.4, but we had to go raise the money. We had to raise money cheap enough so we didn't have to raise our rents dramatically to pay our interest to our investors. For every percent interest we had to pay, we had to raise our rents about $45, $35 to $45. So I was able to raise the money at 2.99%. If it was 10.99%, I would have had to raise my rent about $350 to $400 a month just to pay my investors. So that doesn't really go with affordability. We needed strong experience management, a safety security plan. We had to screen tenants. We had to renovate the property, and then we had to build, once the property's safe, we start building those community partnerships. So let's start with raising the money. As I mentioned, we had to raise roughly $9.6 million. In 2018, 17, 18, it was very hard to raise money cheap. The environment's much better now. You have the Housing Opportunity Bond, and there's a lot more political capital around low-income financing for apartments. But we were able to raise the money at 2.99%. It took me about 15 tries to get a lender. The lenders don't want to invest in these areas, but we finally got Renaissance Bank. We got a loan from a family foundation at 0% interest. We got the Housing Opportunity Bond from the City of Atlanta at 1%. And then we did a TriStar Social Impact Fund, where we raised the money, my partner and I did, and we started at a 2% return, and it grows to a 4% return. All right, oh, let me go back. And so our goal is if we could raise the money at that 2.99%, we could start our rents at $595 was our goal. And then a 3-bedroom would go for $826, it averaged $730. So someone earning roughly $29,000 a year could live there. And that's what our demographics were, roughly, I think we were $27,000 a year, so we were close. So we had to have strong experience management. You can read what the challenges were. And this is the other key. You really have to have staffing that's willing to take the risk of working these properties. They have to have real passion for the community. And all our staff gets trauma certified. Everyone in our company goes through CRIS 180 to get trauma certified. And it really helps us deal with the tenants because these populations are so traumatized. And you'll read in the book where, they're screaming at us and they're have very colorful words to tell us when they're not having a good day. And you have to just really be patient and know how to deal with trauma. So here's just some management issues. We had, our units were torn up. The police were there daily, and we had pretty bad roach infestations. Safety and security. So that's the number one thing. And when I speak, everyone says, aren't you scared? Yeah, we're scared, but we have a plan around that. We have licensed police officers to start with, 24/7. My staff didn't go anywhere without a police escort. We had to secure the area and repair the fencing, as you'll read in the book. I mean, we had hundreds of people on the weekends coming through buying the drugs. So the first thing we did was fix the gate. Luckily we partnered with the Atlanta Police Department, and then we partnered with the Atlanta Police Foundation. We were very fortunate, but you gotta have it. So here's the built environment. So here's phase one. All right, the red was all boarded up. This section right here is where the drug dealers had commanded the courtyard, and they also had the kind of the unit up there, D12 was pretty famous. That's phase two. It was built in 1998. And then there's Cleveland Avenue Elementary. There's the Exxon where our drug dealer shot at the McDonald's. I mean, it just went back and forth. And he actually did the apartments kind of to the left of Cleveland Avenue Elementary. This is along 75. So with the Atlanta Police Foundation, we installed security cameras. It was $45,000, but it was worth every penny. They literally could sit in their office and just watch the property from the cameras. And that's how they did their stakeout. When you're buying these properties, you have got to have the budget to do these things. We screened tenants, and the first 2 years, we probably accepted 2 for every 10 that came through the door. We're really good at screening out the potential drug dealers and the phantom tenants, the people that are going to front them. So you have to just be really, really careful with your screening. You've got to let your security get to know the tenants, and you've got to enforce the rules. It's very hard. Renovation, we did a $6 million renovation. That was our goal. We ended up a lot higher. Luckily, we had a really good team, former Marine named Jeff Miller, who you'll read about in the book. This is just some examples of things we did. There's an interior of the unit. It's not bad. I mean, there are 2-bedroom townhomes. We put in granite floor or tile floors, granite countertops. They're really nice units. Hardwood upstairs. Partnerships to build social capital. This is the fun part. So basically what we do is to build social capital, we start partnering. Star C is a non-for-profit that I actually started, and it brings the community services in, like after-school programs, summer camps. We partnered with Morehouse to bring medical services in. We have health fairs a couple times a year. Georgia Power basically went in and did energy efficiency throughout all the units, and it saves about $30 a month on the electric bill. We talked about the Atlanta Police Foundation. Georgia Tech did a whole class on this property to help us come up with ways to ethically develop community around the structural environment. Kaboom built a playground with us, sponsored by the CarMax. And we had a lot of churches involved. So here's some examples of just events we have at all our properties, not just this one. So you can see we have a Cub Scout troop now. That's my partner, Audrey. I was the Cub Scout leader. And we now have that at all our properties. We did an eviction relief fund. Our goal was to raise $50,000. We raised $12.5 million. We were quite surprised. It totally changed Star C. We helped about 4,200 families pay rent. You can see the federally qualified health clinic, dental health, school. Right here, we put all the kids on a bus and take them to the federally qualified health clinic to get school ready. They see a doctor, dentist, vision, and hearing. So you can kind of see one of the things we're working on. There's Georgia Tech, the class that came out and studied the property and just did a beautiful job coming up with ideas. Yeah?
I see so many police back there.
You recognize people?
Yeah. Oh, I like to do it.
Yeah, that's the professor, Frank Wickstead. Yeah. I'm hopeful he'll adopt Blighted, and I'll do a class this coming fall. I think that would just be wonderful. And that's Jeff Miller. That's my construction. He actually went to Tech. He got a master's at Emory, but he's a Marine, so he was not intimidated by the drug dealers. So were we successful? I'm just reminding you of how we knew we were successful. So let's talk about where we ended up. So here is our capital stack. So we went through the regulatory process with the City of Atlanta, which is the boringest, hardest chapter to read in the book. It's painful, painful to read. The City of Atlanta doesn't really have a path for blighted apartments like this, so they kind of made it up as they went along, and they kept changing everything. But anyway, the bottom line is it added $3 million to our construction costs. And unfortunately, we had to borrow more money, so we couldn't offer rents at $730. We ended up at $896. So just the City of Atlanta regulatory environment added $166 a month, okay? What happens when you raise your rents $100? Homelessness goes up 15%. That's a fact. And we saw this in our tenant base. I mean, some of our tenants made $15,000 to $20,000 a year. They couldn't afford that kind of rent increase. So that's where we ended up, and yes, I have given this to our mayor. Here's where we ended up with crime. Now, these were COVID numbers. I think they're actually a little bit worse, but this is what the numbers I had that I was given. Our crime is actually down 96%. Just doing the things, fixing the gates, having the police officers, screening the tenants, eventually arresting the drug dealers, and cleaning up the property. We have very strong community partnerships. We partnered, like I said, with Star C, and here's some examples of some events we've had at the property. We'll talk a little bit about how we started our eviction relief fund. We had 317 landlords representing 63,000 units signed into the program. There's our Kaboom playground, happiest day. I just love these. This is the second one we've done. And I just love looking at this picture because, I mean, we have our police officer, there were a lot of city council members there were judges, the kids designed the playground, they were thrilled. And these were kids that for years went from apartment to school, apartment to school. They couldn't get out into the community because it was so dangerous. You know, a lot of tenants talked about how they told their kids they trained them how to run when the gun fire started. They'd hide behind bushes. It was heartbreaking to hear that from the kids. So this was just a really happy day. And even better, the first year that we had our Star C program, we had 18 kids in the program, and our children outperformed their peers on the milestone. And we were surprised. Typically, it takes a couple years, but within the first year, they were already outperforming their peers just doing that intervention. And our discretionary purchasing power has gone from 3.6 to 7.7 million. So we're getting a little bit better tenant in there. So you're starting to see the commercial come back a little bit stronger. And I was invited to speak to the Kansas State public health care workers in September, and I'm sitting there going, why does the big conference on healthcare workers in Kansas want a landlord? And so we Googled landlord and healthcare, my partner and I did, and we found the social determinants of health. How many of you have heard of this? I've never heard of this before. I'm shocked at how many people have heard of this and how come landlords haven't heard of this. But anyway, so as we went through the social determinants, we realized our Star C TriStar model was addressing all 6 of them. You know, we're about economic stability, you know, neighborhoods, building playgrounds, parks, education, food, security, all of it.
I think,
Yeah.
I think I've heard this in city planning class before, I'm not sure. They said determinants of health, it's like, okay, all right, but where?
Yeah,
Is
it's
that
been a,
how
so we've totally changed how we package Star C to address the social determinants of health. And actually, United Healthcare just gave us $1 million to bring it out to our platform of 62,000 units. So here's Star C today. I put a tattoo on the D12 building that you'll read about. That's where all the drug dealers were, just to make it clear that this is not where the drug dealers are hanging out anymore. But yeah, there's our kids. I love this photo here. Both these young men are honor students. We've never had honor students before. So they're doing great. And then we had an event with Morehouse last November. We had 12 interns show up and do community health outreach. It was great. And here's our social impact metrics. So typically when we take over a property like this, we create about $1 million in social capital. There's no formal way to measure. This is our measurements, but we created about $1.2 million, $1.3 million in social capital. And I'm almost done. This is why this matters, why dangerous dwellings in a model like this matters. So this is the history of building permits by the US Census. You can see the peak years for construction were right here, 69 to 75, because you had baby boomers coming into the market forming households. But if you look at the line right here, 1993, more than 60% of all apartments now are over 30 years old. So these dangerous dwellings, and this is a reality for generations going forward. We're just simply not building enough housing, and we're going to have to deal with aging housing. Here's some examples of properties I've been trying to buy. This one's too late now. I could have bought it. If I could have bought it 5 years ago, I could have saved it. But yeah, they're all throughout Atlanta. And that's the book Blighted. And that's it. Thank you.
Hello, hello. All right, so what we're going to do now is a short question and answer section. So if anybody wants to ask any questions of Marjy, please line up at this mic over here. You might have to, there's a, yeah.
Testing. Hi.
Hi.
I haven't bought your book yet, but like after this presentation, I think I'm going to. I wish I would have gotten it signed today, but like maybe later on. I don't know. But okay, so my question is, because you talked about how housing has a really big impact, like even just like a apartment complex can have a really big impact on the community, and you know, like what you did was really good. Like you really improved the well-being there. But I'm thinking about how we could translate those lessons that you learned into like the public sphere, like through policy and measures and through like executive actions. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on like how we can turn that into a more systematic sort of solution?
That's an excellent question. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, to give transparency to the model so people could really understand. Evicted was really from the tenant's perspective. This book is from the landlord's perspective. And Jeff and my architect are actually working on how we frame up policy around construction. I mean, because that to me is the biggest hurdle for affordable housing is construction. You know, they can randomly say, oh, no, we want you to do all this. And it's, you know, $500,000 and you can't defend yourself, even if it's not in the code. There's no way to not do it. So yes, I agree. And the first place we're starting is in the fire marshal and the permitting is where we're going to start nationwide. But it's going to take generations. And I love it that you're going to read this book, because this is it's a generational issue for you.
Yeah.
You know, there's opportunity for you here.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for coming out tonight. What I wanted to ask a bit about is like, what are the biggest barriers to scaling this model other than money? So assume we have a big pile of cash, hopefully public dollars, but what else would it take? Because I think when you identified in one of those last slides, there are so many older units, and that's really kind of defaulted to being so much of our affordable housing stock. But if it's low quality housing, that's not doing anybody a lot of favors either. And so how could we do this, particularly in Atlanta, faster and at scale, again, putting money aside for the moment?
So these apartments have become a commodity. They're traded around the world. I get calls probably daily of someone wanting to buy my property that doesn't live in Atlanta. So it's become a commodity. So it's caught up now in capitalism. And you have to fight capitalism with capitalism. The number one thing is you have to have the will of the landlord to do this. We started a Starseed Breakfast in 2015. We do it the last Thursday of every month. And the reason we did that was to attract landlords. As I tell people, I can't own all these units, but I can certainly motivate other landlords. And we have about 15 landlords that are now following the model. And we have the state of Georgia that now mandates some resident services to get tax credits. You get extra points. So it's trending in this way. But yeah, I mean, it's a pot of money, and it's also the permitting and code enforcement. I mean, I know we have other developers in the audience. I mean, that is a real problem. And a lot of these apartments were built in antiquated, obsolete codes that don't apply anymore. So that's the other big hurdle I see, is to get the permitting and the fire marshal. As I say in a statistic when I meet with city council people, roughly 2,900 people die a year in fires. 2,900 people die, of which 15% live in apartments. So roughly 400 people die a year from apartment fires. But there's 600,000 people homeless, and the average loss of life is 20 years. So we're losing 120,000 lives a year because we can't address the housing to save 2,900. And the fire marshals, that's their metric. They just want it to be zero, and they're going to make it as harsh as possible. So I'm really starting to discuss that too. So yeah, it's money, and it's getting the fire marshal behind it. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask, in terms of the fire marshal thing, can you give us like a couple examples where it doesn't make sense or it's tedious or whatever?
So, and I've got to put on my permitting cap on. There's 3 levels in the city of Atlanta of renovation. We were level 1. We were not changing any walls, nothing, okay? The fire marshal or the permitting person, she didn't care. Even though you're level 1, we want you to tear out all the walls and replace them with they were 5/8 fire rated. They wanted a 1 hour fire rated. They didn't care, even if it wasn't in the code. And they wouldn't give us permits for a year because they just wouldn't argue with us. When we tore out the walls, we had an inspector go, oh, now that your electrical and plumbing's exposed, you have to replace it all. So now we had to replace electrical and plumbing, even though it wasn't in the code. And it was $1.8 million. That's what added the $166. That's one example. The second is this was a series of 16-unit row houses, 16 units per building. You would get inspector number 1 come in and go, okay, I'll allow this electrical to pass if you do these 5 things. And we do the 5 things. A different inspector would come in and go, I don't like that, it's wrong, tear it out, you now gotta do these 5 things. The city of Atlanta follows 2 different codes and they compete, and they're not clear. So, and this is, every developer tells you, I'm hearing amens in the audience from the housing section here. Everyone will tell you this is you're just at the whim of the permitting person. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, these are kind of garden style 2-story units. I'm curious if you've seen other models where older high rises or is this is this the opportunity that you're seeing market-wise, nationwide, which are aging 40, 50-year-old garden-style apartments?
Yes, I think this is the opportunity. Anything built after 1969, and one of the ones in the photo was built in the 50s. It's a cookie cutter. They're 2-bedroom, 1 bath. They're like 750 units, and they're made of cinder block. But some of them you can still save, and I think you can save them and offer rents at $700. And it's not perfect. The other thing about the fire marshal, which is interesting to me, is, I've had the 446 unit deal. They go, no, you have to bring this building up to code, but the other 440 units are not up to code. And that makes no sense to me. But yeah, I think that's the opportunity, is the vintage stuff.
Okay, I had actually a couple questions for you.
Sure.
I was able to, read the book, and one story that really fascinated me was the story of Madison Hills and the Cobb County political process. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, political will and getting buy-in from leaders, municipal and local leaders, and how crucial that is to be able to revitalize marginalized apartment communities like this.
So I'm a nice lady. I was in my nice suit going in front of Cobb County to get a zoning variance on some buildings they were trying to condemn. And this commissioner by the name of Bob Ott just chewed me out in a room of hundreds of people. And I'm like, I'm a nice lady. I'm trying to buy this blighted apartment and renovate. I had a $7 million budget. What's your problem? So luckily, after the meeting, we went and introduced ourselves to him. His children went to Brumby Elementary, which was the school that was failing because of this apartment community. They were just trying to tear it down, and I said, how can you put 446 units in the dump? So anyway, it took us 4 years to get those permits, 4 years. Luckily, we paid cash. I had raised the money. We didn't have a debt on it. I probably would have lost it in foreclosure. We renovated the property. We turned the school around. Brumby Elementary became a Title I school of distinction because of us. We had 90 kids at that school. About 2017, Commissioner Ott calls me on the phone one day. He goes, I am calling you to apologize for yelling at you. He goes, can I be on your nonprofit board? I said, yes. So that's how we ended it with Bob Ott. But now I think a lot of the municipal leaders see that this is what you have to do, or deal with a massive homeless issue.
And if there's not buy-in from them, it can make your life a lot more difficult, I'm assuming.
Right.
Yeah. So moving on to a slightly different topic, I was really interested in the story of Melinda Wyatt, and I'm curious, what do you think, if you could quickly summarize kind of what happened for the crowd, anybody who hasn't read, and sort of what do you think is the responsibility of the landlord to work with uncooperative or unwilling tenants who maybe are traumatized from years of neglect?
So as I mentioned, this experience really changed my DNA. And as I sat in the apartments, or met Melinda Wyatt, she came from the projects. What I learned was what causes a property to become blighted. Is it the structural environment? Is it the tenant environment? And I think the conclusion of everyone in the book that talked about it is it's the tenants cause it to become blighted, because the tenants do control the structural environment. And she's a great example. She grew up in extreme poverty. Her mother was very ill, had asthma, and she had 4 children, and she worked at Goodwill. She made $8 an hour, 2018. Her husband worked at Wendy's and made $8 an hour. So they, between them, made $32,000 a year. And her apartment, I'll never forget walking in. It was just filthy. And we did everything in our power to work with her. And I really liked her. I felt like she was a really good mom in some ways. She really tried, but her apartment was so roach infested. We finally had to evict her, and we didn't want to. We actually completely gutted her apartment and because her mom was hearing impaired, and she just didn't see it. She didn't see how her actions were causing her unit to become blighted. But anyway, after we ended up, should I say what we did with it? She got evicted, and it broke my heart. But I went to her eviction, and afterwards I interviewed her for an hour just to talk to her. And then I interviewed her a year later to see where she landed. And she landed in that dangerous dwelling that was featured, Pavilion Place, in that article. That's like the one where that's where she was living. And it just broke my heart. But she grew up in poverty, and she had that poverty mentality.
You had mentioned having to bring in specialists, and as I understand it, you had to bring in a pest control specialist, and there was a lot of working with different tenants to try to, get rid of, because obviously when you have cockroaches and bed bugs, that's kind of you can do the best you can, but it has to be both sides who are willing to work on that and do what needs to be done. So you kind of already answered this question, kind of what causes a community to become blighted, but I guess thinking in reverse, sort of what comes first in healing a blighted or marginalized community? Is it security? Is it the community culture? Is it the built environment, et cetera?
Security. Mm-hmm. I mean, the first thing you have to do is secure the environment, because if you don't feel safe, you can't build social capital. And that's the property management staff, the tenant staff, even the police officers, had to feel safe living there. So yeah, you have to address the security first. And we really hesitated starting our after-school program because we started it in phase 1, and the drug dealers were still active. But we made a decision. We talked with Kristen, who's also in the book. She ran the after-school program, and we decided to go ahead and start it. And we had police escorts with the kids. So.
All right. Actually, you know what? I did have one more question. Anthony Fowler, the drug kingpin. It apparently took a little while to sort of figure out who he was, and I guess sort of what I'm wondering is, how do you go about sort of identifying and understanding the community culture of an apartment building that you've recently purchased, and understanding who the main points are, who the people who are sort of most involved in causing the issues might be?
Well, they do not come up and introduce themselves. They're hiding from you. And it took us over a year to identify him. And I saw him, one of the first days I was there, I saw him, and he looked like he was a preacher. I mean, he had an Izod shirt, he was preppy, and yeah, he lived in 2 apartments, and he paid the phantom tenant in the book, Sharon, I had to change names, Sharon. She would not let me interview her, but she was the little 18-year-old that rented this apartment, and he gave her $2,000 a month to front his operation. So it's very hard to identify. And the other thing we did is we did not wipe the apartment clean. We didn't just go in and evict everyone, because as you'll read about, like Miss Humphreys, who had lived there for 23 years and raising the 4th generation, we knew that there were valuable tenants that had lived there for years. And so we felt like we gave ourselves a year to really study it. Most landlords would just evict everybody and say, sorry. And I mean, there are so many tenants that I interviewed that would have been homeless. So we wanted to, and I think it's a hard way to do it, but I think I would continue to do it that way. Just one more thing is what was hard about this property too is it was 2 separate units, so you had so many entrances. At Madison, the 446 unit one, I only had 1 entrance, so we could really control. And I had licensed police officers at the entrance that were carding and arresting. But here it was much harder because you had so many entrances and exits. You couldn't just have a police officer 24/7 at each one. So that made it really hard too.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you
Sure.
very much. I don't know if there are any other questions, so if you,
Jen?
please.
Can you just tell us a little more about Ms. Humphreys, because I think she's such a great parent.
She's the sweetest lady. And I tell you, when people ask me if I was scared, I always think of Mrs. Humphreys walking her great-grandson to school every day through the drug dealers and the gunfire, and I was like, if Miss Humphreys can do it, we can do it. I just saw her recently. She had COVID, it's in the book, but she's doing fine. I mean, she's doing really fine. And to talk about YIMBY, Mrs. Humphreys, it turned out, I live in Midtown, she was a domestic at one of my neighbor's house. So this woman had been coming into my neighborhood for 22 years, working for a family in my neighborhood. And it just goes to show you how, you know, we need to have affordable housing options for everyone. So,
I'm
yes.
curious about automobile ownership. What fraction of the units, I assume it was very low.
About 30% did not own a car. So,
It's higher than I would think.
yeah, so Melinda didn't, they had 1 car, and her husband got the car. The guy that worked for Wendy's got the car. So, but the good thing about Summerdale is it was on a bus stop, right on Cleveland Avenue. It was a block away. So you always saw people at the bus stop. So, yes.
I finished it this morning, and I know belaboring it because you talked about it. The thing that kept catching my attention was the permits. And I know you talked about as you said, they come and say, well, no, now we've changed our minds. Somebody's got to be in charge. Who in Atlanta has the power to be more affordable house friendly or renovation friendly? With our housing issue, that's just huge.
And you made it through the chapter? It's such a hard chapter to read. I can't even hardly read it. It gets so mad.
I
when
thought it
read
was
that chapter.
fascinating, personally.
It's like,
They got the coast to hire themselves, and those numbnuts don't hire themselves, and there's people, who do they work for? What's the change? How does it ever change to be where you don't add $3 million costs?
so the very good news is Mayor Dickens was in Leadership Atlanta with Jen Christensen and I, okay? And he's, I mean, when he was a city councilman, I dragged him to Summerdale. Right when I met him, I'm like, you're coming here and we're spending the day talking about housing. And he'll say, who is this woman? Leave me alone. But we did it. He hired Courtney English, who used to work for Star C. So Courtney went through this with us. He's in the book. And they're doing everything in their power to rebuild permitting now. And so this is on their agenda.
Reports sooner or later into the mayor.
He is the mayor's senior advisor. I mean, he's in the office with the mayor. And they're working on this right now. We've got a 446-unit property we're trying to get the permits right now in West Atlanta, and it's this model. And our rents will start at $750. And I mean, we are having the hardest time getting the permits. And the mayor and Courtney are all over this, and they're seeing firsthand how hard this is.
We got one more while I've got the floor.
Sure.
Do you find it more attractive to do one of these here and then find another one there? And if so, tell me what sort of makes you attracted to a particular property? Or you find it attractive to stick in an area? How do you choose?
It has to have a failing school. Okay, so it has to be like southeast and west of Atlanta. They're very hard to buy right now because landlords want fortunes for them. There's not a sustainable business model, so that's why we've been building, not buying. You can build them for the same price you can buy them. And it's interesting with the interest rates going up. This week alone, I've had 3 deals call me. 3 people call me and go, okay, we're interested in selling you this. It's a dangerous dwelling. But they still want, you can't keep your rents affordable. So the prices are starting to come down. I think we're going to be really active starting next year. We're going to see a lot more opportunity. And in House ATL, we're trying to raise $75 million. We just raised 15 from TruStar. You're starting to see the equity come this way too. It's a combination of cheap money with grants. So you're really starting to see the equity come. Yay. Any more questions? Yes.
Have you found NEPA to be a major obstruction to housing?
Have I found?
NEPA laws, a major obstruction to developing more housing.
What's NEPA?
Like some,
I believe a National Environmental Policy Act, maybe? Is that?
No.
like sort of the environmental review stuff.
For new construction, yes. For existing, not really.
And new construction.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were supposed to close this deal in September of 21, and a form was not filed. An environmental form was not filed with HUD. So we are still trying to get it finalized a year and a half later.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
No, I meant that though.
So yeah, it can be a real drag. So.
Yeah, because that's what I've seen from other UD planners talk about. Like it's also ironically holding back public transit.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we can build all the highways we want and somehow make those Byzantine constructions, but it's stopping us from doing rails.
You know what it boils down to? No one wants to lose their job. That's what it boils down to. No one wants to lose their job.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. They don't want to make a bad decision, so they make the worst possible decision. You know, the harshest one that protects them the most.
Yeah, it's an example of, I guess, not wanting to take risks, but then you end up doing the riskiest and stupidest thing out there.
Yeah.
I've seen that enough times.
Well, all right. If you'll join me in giving Marjy a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. This was really nice. If anybody is interested, I'll be up at the front here, and I can tell you more about abundant housing. Otherwise, thank you all for coming.